Our talks on mysticism and Shakespeare. You don't have to have been here for any of the previous talks to fit in. It's almost like a river that keeps flowing and flowing and flowing. I'm an Orphic, and Orpheus's head, even after it was ripped off and thrown into the stream, sang all the way downstream, and it sang when it got to the ocean, and they picked it up and they put it in a cave underground in a grotto, and it still sang. That's my ideal. You can come and go as you like and enjoy it and pass the word on to other people. My golly, I got schedules here somewhere, but I forgot. On the back one of these. Pass the rest around to other people. Gila has the schedules. I'll have a spring schedule sometime before the end of this fall is over. For people who are new, who have never been here before, these are not meant to be pretentious talks. We're not doing Shakespeare because Shakespeare had that vocabulary that includes most of the words in the English language or anything like that. And we're not using Shakespeare for literary reasons, even though we will appreciate the beauty of the dialogue and the beauty of the poetry and all of that. We're using Shakespeare because in the plays, Shakespeare has addressed so many subjects, and so many of those subjects touch on mystical topics. And so what Shakespeare is for somebody like me, it's like a smorgasbord. It is a perfect springboard for mystical and intuitive free association. There are what jazz musicians would call releases, where you can do epicycles onto almost anything, and that's right up my alley. I can think of no other source in all of literature that addresses as many things as Shakespeare does, and that does it so beautifully and so provocatively. Obviously, because of this, we're going to go slowly through the plays, especially The Tempest. It's probably going to take us at least a half a dozen talks to get through The Tempest, because there are so many side trips and there are so many big issues in it, and some ideas about it that you'll probably not find anywhere else. We're going to have a really good time with it. On the other hand, the talks are not meant to be purposeless or in undirected miscellany. We do try to see each play as a whole, and we try to see a play as a thing in itself. And also, since this is mostly a series of talks on mysticism and less on Shakespeare, we choose plays according to a theme. And the plays are selected for their relevance to the theme, which is a large-scale theme that I want to address. Consequently, the order of plays as we present them would baffle almost any literary Shakespeare person, because it's not scholarly at all, and this isn't intended to be scholarly. The first series of talks we did was on the cycles of Christ and Persephone, and we chose plays according to the 4 seasons and the cycle that goes with that. We chose A Winter's Tale for winter, Julius Caesar for a spring equinox play, A Midsummer Night's Dream for a summer play, and the last act act of Hamlet was obviously like a threshing floor, and we chose that for an autumnal equinox play. It's also the character very much of a Libra kind of person. Right now we're in the middle of our second series, which is Magic, Black and White, and we're using just 2 plays to address that theme. Basically, because there are only 2 plays in Shakespeare which really look at magic. Last year, we looked at Macbeth, which had all sorts of qualities about black magic and witchcraft and things like that in it. And this year, starting tonight, we are going to look at The Tempest, because it addresses the topic of white magic and the evolution of humanity and quite a few other things. The Tempest was written near the very end of Shakespeare's career. Many people believe at the very end. And there's internal evidence in the play to indicate that it may have been his last play, his parting shot. In his career, he wrote a number of different kinds of plays. He wrote melodramas, such as Titus Andronicus, which some people would argue is a tragedy. Comedies, such as the Comedy of Errors. Histories, such as Henry V. Tragedies, such as Othello. And the latter plays were called tragicomedies, such as The Winter's Tale. The tragicomedies had tragic flaws and grievous mistakes in them, but they always had happy endings. Usually the tragicomedies include Pericles, Prince of Tyre, Cymbeline, Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. Yes, because the name in England now is Kimball. Yeah, it's the Welsh don't know how to don't know how to pronounce anything. The tragicomedy in its time was a very great departure from the tradition of drama. Pericles, for example, is almost like a Broadway extravaganza. You know, it's all over the world and all kinds of events happening. And The Tempest was probably considered by far the most unusual play, maybe of all of the plays that Shakespeare did. Aristotle, who had things to say about almost everything, many of which were not right, he managed to imprison all of the Western world in his thought for too many centuries, had ideas that there had to be an economy of time and place in a play. When we did Winter's Tale, we saw that play certainly broke from that economy, because the action in Winter's Tale takes place over 14 years, and it takes place between two countries. So it's obviously Aristotle wouldn't have approved of it at all. Now, this year I like these Signet Classics, and I promised last year that I was going to get a copy for everyone to loan, so that we would all be reading the same edition with the same line numbers, but unfortunately I didn't get through all of the paperwork. Signet has been bought up, or somebody who was bought out by somebody else, and you have to open up an established account to order from them, and I'd have to order a humongous number of books, and they don't allow pro forma orders anymore. I finally found one little old lady that knows what the word pro forma means. That means when you make an order and they send you an invoice, and it says on their pro forma invoice, and when you send the money in, then they ship. It's like no money, no books kind of thing. I'm happy to deal that way, but Signet is not happy to deal that way. So I'll work something on. So we're going to have to use the books that we have. Yeah, I don't mind I don't mind paying for it, but it's just a matter of getting them all, And if I'm going to go to the trouble to get them all, I don't want to go through a university bookstore. I might as well take advantage of the discount as long as I can get it. All right, let's all read the first scene. And since you're the star, you get to choose what role you'd like. I think you ought to read the boatswain, because that's clearly right up. You know how to deal something out with sass. She's an actress. She's in acting school in New York City right now, and is taking a little. Osama bin Laden gave her a little hiatus from school. Let's see, who wants to be the master? All right, he can be the master. You want to be the master? Your name is? Nick. Good. Anybody want to be Alonzo? Millie, you didn't bring a book, huh? All right, anybody have a book? Roz has got one. All right. You'll be Alonzo. I'll be Antonio. And somebody has to be Gonzalo. Shard, you want to be Gonzalo? All right. Oh, okay. You can take Antonio. Because Gonzalo has nice things to say. Oh, that's right.
Did they have to say them?
No, he likes hurling insults around. All right. And since nobody, I can hand the book to you, and you can read Sebastian. We can see how you are at hurling insults. All right, Master started all. What Master doesn't get much to say at all. One line. But I suppose by now you're used to bit parts. When you're first breaking in, right? All right, you can open it up.
Boatswain.
Here, Master. What cheer?
Good, speak to the mariners. Fall to it yearly, or we run ourselves aground. To stir! To stir!
Hi, my heart. Cheerily, cheerily, my heart. Yeah, yeah. Taking the topsail. Tend to the master's whistle. Blow to thou burst thy wind if room enough.
Good boatswain, have care. Where's the master? Play the men.
Okay, now keep below.
Where is the master, boatswain?
Do not hear him. You mar our labor. Keep your cabin to do assist the storm.
Nay, good be patient.
When the sea is. Hey, what cares these roars for the name of king? Cabin, silence, trouble us not.
Good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard.
None that I more love than myself. You are a counselor. You can command these elements of silence and work the peace of the present. We will not hand a rope more. Use your authority. If you cannot, give thanks to have lived so long, and make yourself ready in your cabin for the mischance of the hour, if it so hap. Cheerily, good heart. Out of our way, I say.
I have great comfort from this fellow. Methinks he hath no drowning mark upon him. His complexion is perfect gallows. Stand fast, good faith, to his hanging. Make the rope of his destiny our cable, for our own doth little advantage. If he not be hanged, our case is miserable.
Down with the topmast. Yeah, lower, lower. Bring her to try with main course. A plague upon this howling. They are louder than the weather or our author. Yet again, what do you here? Shall we give o'er and drown? Have you a mind to think?
A fox o'er your throat, you falling, blasphemous, incharitable dog.
What do you then?
Anchor, hang you, whoreson, insolent noisemaker. We are less afraid to be drowned than thou art.
Oh, I'm Gonzalo. All right, I got it. I'll warrant him for drowning, though the ship were no stronger than a nutshell and as leaky as an unstanched wench. Oh, I see, that's good.
Lay her a hold. A hold. Set her 2 courses. Off to sea again. Lay her off. All lost. All lost. What, must our mouths be cold?
Oh, I'm on again.
Oh,
The king and prince at prayers. Let's assist them, for our case is theirs.
I am out of patience.
We are merely cheated of our lives by drunkards. This white-chap rascal, would thou mightst lie drowning, washing of 10 tides?
He'll be hanged yet, though every drop of water swear against it, and gape at the widest to glut him. Mercy on us, it's all of us. Mercy on us, we split, we split. Farewell, my wife and children. Farewell, brother, we split, we split.
Let's all sink with the king.
Let's take leave of him.
Now would I give 1,000 furlongs of sea for an acre of barren ground. Long heath, brown furze, anything. The wills above be done, but I would fain die a dry death. It's all participation for tonight. It's that kind of night. It's introductory night. Plato complained a lot about poets, most notably Homer. And by Plato's judgment, he said poets lied. He said they lied by writing about things as though they knew things from experience, when they really hadn't had that experience. But they knew very, very little, and because of their writing skill, they got a lot of mileage out of it, and he considered that lying. Well, Plato is certainly to be admired for his honesty and for his integrity, but I'm not completely certain that he is right in this case. In other places, he claims that the best way to knowledge, gnosis, is direct experience. And not only direct experience, but thinking on that experience and remembering to intuit about that experience. In other places yet, he does allow for the fact that some people, like poets, he even mentions them, know things by what he calls right opinion. If you look at his definition of right opinion, it's very much the way we use the word intuition. If one has intuition, even in a minor experience of the world, one can sometimes grasp a great deal in the moment. Shakespeare is probably a really good example of Plato's poet, both in the mileage that he gets and in the intuitions. When you read Shakespeare, it's almost like he knew everything about everything. In this case, it is sailing, how to handle a ship in a storm. He seems to get it all correctly, and he seems to have definite knowledge. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. The subject of definite knowledge is called epistemology by philosophers. It is a study of how we learn. Plato, from our experience, obviously seems to be correct in his high integrity statement. He says that we learn by experience when that experience is completely digested. No matter how much we study or how much we are told, we don't seem to learn a lot of things except by experience. When I snag this wire and snap it, I will learn by experience. Jerry and I had a vigorous discussion earlier about the wire on the new microphone. The sad part about it is that we don't always learn from experience. And because we are as stubborn and pig-headed as we are, we sometimes have to have the same experience over again and again before we learn from it. That's inefficient. On the other hand, study, especially if accompanied by intuition, is a form of experience also. It would be a fool that would undertake a very complicated task without using the manual, which classifies all males as fools. I actually read the manual this time when I got a new microphone in. So, study, even though it is a more indirect form of experience, can be a valid source of knowledge, even though it doesn't seem as sure as direct experience. Study seems to be a valid source of knowledge to the degree that we take it seriously and if we live it through like a life experience. However, both study and direct experience seem to be inefficient. Direct experience because it takes so long, and study because it's indirect. One cannot experience or study everything in life. There's just too much. You can learn a great deal from study, but you can spend your whole life studying, and like you could spend several incarnations just studying chemistry alone and not get to the end of it. Perhaps the knowledge of the poet, or the knowledge of Shakespeare especially, is an intimation of another way of coming to knowledge. Maybe it isn't just insight into a moment, but that insight is far more pervasive, and that it opens us to a kind of consciousness that is a mystical kind of consciousness where we can understand as much in a moment, in a brief instant, as some people could in years. For example, Mozart could hear an entire symphony in a fraction of a second. And it was such a total, complete experience, it took him a long time to unwind it and to delineate it. This is what the claim of mysticism is. That if we improve our attention through the senses and open ourselves in receptivity to intuition, that we can tap in a kind of spiritual perception knowledge that is not available to other people, that is the essence of many other people's experiences. You could live their whole lives as they had lived them. In a moment you could relive the whole life of Shakespeare if you had such an experience. So Shakespeare certainly seems to be an example of that possibility. Be that as it may, even with the evolutionary development of Shakespeare, I'm still not sure I would want Shakespeare taking care of the boat if it were sinking, but that may be why I have this kind of material consciousness that I have. Frankly, I would take the outspoken bosun who didn't want to be distracted from his work by kings or nobles or anyone else. And that brings on another aspect of this scene. This is going to be terribly slow tonight. And that is the setting itself. Probably all night we're going to talk about settings. This scene is about a tempest. The tempest after which the play is named. We have encountered in other plays storms in other forms. When we looked at Winter's Tale, we looked at the storm in which Antigonus was attacked by a bear, and his ship and all evidence of his existence went down in that same storm. when we looked at Julius Caesar, we saw a storm the night before his death and all sorts of prodigies of nature. Lions prowling the streets, ghosts leaving their graves, and things like that. So we want to look at storms or tempests again. We want to look at it a slightly different way as it relates to something that we're going to unfold over the course of these talks. That is magic. And we want to look at some other facets of storms. Storms, we know from meteorology, are interactions between low and high pressure systems, between cyclones and anticyclones. Both cyclones and anticyclones are very large vortices. Storms themselves have intense vortices right within them. Sometimes tornadoes, sometimes hurricanes, sometimes water spouts that pick up entire schools of fish and drop them somewhere else. There's a good deal of energy that is bound up in these swirling vortices. It's originally solar energy, but it's changed a good deal. There is very low pressure at the heart or the eye of a vortex, and everything feels very concentrated or very dense, like those heavy days before, heavy moments before a really tough thunderstorm is coming in. Everything looks green even. It looks like you're entering into the ethers. In actuality, high pressure is more dense than low pressure, but it doesn't have that same kind of concentration. The world that we live in, though it seems solid, we can stand here and be held on the ground, is a good deal more fluid than we think. It requires enormous force to hold atoms and molecules into the crystalline, solid state. Liquids, gases, ethers, and all the other spiritual realms are highly fluidic. They are increasingly fluidic. The vortex is the most common expression of energy in a fluidic medium. And so much so it is that mystical teachers and prophets and such in all times, in all religions, have described the manifest expression of divinity as a whirlwind or as a vortical spiral. We are limited as ordinary human beings in our perception and our understanding because our consciousness is limited only to this dense physical world. Nonetheless, even in visible, sensible, physical world that we live in, there are plenty of examples of vortical spirals. Everything from spiral galaxies to the eyewitness accounts of Jehovah leading the people out of Egypt appearing as a whirlwind of fire or a whirlwind of smoke in the daytime. The atoms of our bodies are vortices. A vortex is like a doorway between one world and the next. A doorway through which energy from a higher world can be exerted and expressed in the more dense lower world. the manifest expression of creativity, of destruction, or of transformation is a vortex. Some people see our Milky Way galaxy as a giant vortex that has a black hole at its center that is gradually sucking everything back into it. Analytic psychologists, such as the Jungians, who have their own interpretation of this play, know very well that when there is a major character transformation, when one goes through some kind of epiphany and becomes something else, that always comes about in the midst of a psychological tempest. It's like there's a storm or a whirlwind within ourselves. One that is striving for spiritual awakening, one that is trying to follow a path of apotheosis, knows that all spiritual change comes about in a tempest. Magicians, such as Prospero, will tell you that the gateways between the worlds through which magic is accomplished are vortices. Even the clairvoyance that allows us to see the higher spiritual worlds is brought about by vortices. If one concentrates and sustains a concentration of one's emotions, one can open a vortex in their own auric vehicle that can stretch to the extents of inner space and learn almost anything from it. If there is a sufficiently intense and vigorous vortex, all the elements of all the planes of consciousness can be reduced to a common state, to a unity. All the differentiations can be dissolved, and one can bring things into a common sea of all things. With relation to the world that we see with our eyes, the common sea of energy is called a plasma state. And that plasma state is produced by producing sufficiently intense vortices. The sun itself, from the physical point of view, is a vortex. And it's a plasma in which there are all sorts of thermonuclear interactions taking place. So what we're saying is that in a very curious way, chaos, where everything is dissolved, is a very spiritual state. It's a very pure state. I'd like to bring up an analogy or a metaphor that we brought up at several times before, relating to government and our existence. Very roughly speaking, you can say that the constitution of a human is body, soul, and spirit. Spirit represents the ultimately subtle, unified state that is ultimately etheric. Body is our most discrete state. You pinch it. It's solid. It stays there. It's an outward state. And soul, in this sense of the word, represents anything between body and spirit, where perceptive impulses from the body are taken into the spirit, or where creative activity in the spirit is brought into the body. There is a state of government for each of these. The state of the government for the body is monarchy. have only one spirit in one body. Any more would produce tremendous confusion, as we know, in cases of possession or in cases of multiple personality or something like that. The state of soul where things are brought into or out of existence is hierarchical. There is an antecedence that changes in the physical have to be preceded by changes in energy. And changes in energy have to be preceded by changes in emotion. And changes or motivation. And changes in motivation come about as a result of impulses of thought. And thoughts are expressions of the spirit. So there is a hierarchy, an aristocracy or a meritocracy with regard to the different states of our being. In spirit, everything is democracy. In unity, everything is equal from the lowest human being to the Almighty. In spirit, it's all the same spirit, and we're all equal. Thus, in chaos, there is a reduction or a simplification or an equalization to a common spiritual unity. You guys saw that a couple of weeks ago, that there was chaos and everybody was in unity. So that's exactly what we expect in the midst of a tempest, in the midst of chaos. The bosun recognizes that the king or the noble or anyone else is no more high and mighty than himself. There is a unity, and when things are reduced to essential being and the sustenance of that essential being, there is a commonality. So the bosun doesn't care whether it's a king or a lowly sailor. He just says he treats them all the same. Obviously, the more we live in the unity of common chaos, the more we live like that. We're unprejudiced. We're unaffected. We live in a kind of democracy. It's probably said the best in the Bible where it says, God is not a respecter of persons. We're going to come back to the theme of the storm several times, so we'll just pass on to other things. There's one other thing that I want to go into, and if you're still reading yet, it's the statement by Gonzalo between lines 29 and 34. Gonzalo says, I have great comfort from this fellow. Methinks he hath no drowning mark upon him. His complexion is perfectly gallows. Stand fast, good fate, to his hanging. Make the rope of his destiny our cable, for our own doth little advantage. If he not be born to be hanged, our case is miserable. Looked at with some of the subsequent statements, if you're really stretched, you could find other interpretations to that statement. For example, you could see it that this was a diplomatic threat to the bosun of his fate. If he is too sassy and impertinent, he'll be hung as soon as they get to land. It could be a diplomatic way of placating the nobles from interfering in something of which they are ignorant. I don't know if you know it, but there's something about when people have authority in one thing and they get full of themselves, they think their authority carries into other things. At one time, many years ago, I think in the early 70s, I had a famous rock star in the store here. And some of his groupies brought him in, and it was a terrible conversation. because they wanted to talk about astrology, and he wanted to portray himself, because here he was the star, he wanted to portray himself as knowledgeable about everything, including astrology, and he knew nothing. And I tried to be diplomatic and tell him that he knew nothing in a kindly way, but it ended up being a very uncomfortable situation. But that sort of thing happens. No, he couldn't do that either. It was Graham Nash. I don't know what he's like now. He probably has grown up some since then. I'm somewhat simple, so I take this passage straight forward. Not only that, but from my experience, I agree with it. I'm not a fatalist, nor am I a destiny determinist, nor do I believe in predestination or preordination or anything like that. Life is live and it is real. But after 38 years of practicing astrology, I'm almost certain that most of the major events in life, especially our death, are predetermined. But that predetermination is not arbitrary, and it is not without the pre-consent of the individual behind it. The major events in our lives, whether we're gallows people or drowning people, are not predetermined or determined by forces outside of us, unless we cede our right to our lives to forces outside of us, then they are determined. Most of the events in our life are determined by our character, our living character as it has developed from the past. Cumulative development and actions build up until they result in necessary events that come from definite actions and the energy that is bound up in precipitating those actions. However, even though the majority of the major events in our lives, some people have more of their lives determined before they come to rebirth than others, but though there are major events in our life that are predetermined, it does not mean that we should sit back and not participate in those events. If we see consequences looming on the event horizon, we may be able to creatively transform them into something else, into something beneficial, provided we aren't afraid for our own lives or selfishly want things to go our way. That is a form of transformation. That is something like magical transformation. Some people can take very terrible circumstances and turn them to something positive. If we are not fully aware of the meaning of the events that are coming into our lives and the circumstances in which they are nested, or if we are not strong enough to transform them, we can positively conduct ourselves in a manner that we get the most out of them that we possibly can. Because the only difference between a sinner and a saint, or between a dolt and an enlightened person, is what is gotten out of the same circumstances. Both could be working side by side, doing the same kind of activity, and one getting a great deal out of it, and another very little. There is an actual story about a Zen ceramicist that was the ceramicist to the emperor. And he kept making more and more fragile ceramic. I don't know if you've ever seen that at all, but in China and Japan, ceramic manipulation is the highest art. And they have, I've seen Chinese ceramic that they have stretched out so that it is translucent and that you can see through it. And it's something like Zen painting, where you have that piece of rice paper and you have a brush and you have to do the whole painting in just a very few seconds or else the rice paper is destroyed. And you have to put yourself into that Zen state of consciousness. And this ceramicist to the emperor disappeared one day. And the emperor took alarm and looked for him everywhere. And they found him eventually in a pottery shop, like assembly line production, where everybody was making the same vessels with the same amount of clay, with the same amount of dimensions, and that only he wanted to do that same thing that everyone else was doing, because he thought that was the ultimate state of his spiritual attainment, when he could do the same thing that everyone else around him was doing, but do it with full consciousness and full awareness. Some people would even say that food that came out of such a vessel would probably taste different, but I'm not sensitive to know whether that's true or not. All events, even the ones that seem horrible, are ultimately beneficial. The more so if we can live them to the fullest and get the most out of them. I have had 3 very major experiences in life. I've had what was a little tiny mystical experience, and I have had cancer, and I have gone through a divorce. And in terms of the development of my character and my growth as a human being, the disaster of the cancer and the divorce were far more potent in making me someone better than what I was before. All I need now is half a dozen more calamities to get on the way. But it doesn't have to be that we learn only through calamity. But what I'm trying to illustrate is the fact that all events ultimately work out beneficially. Circumstances of life that surround events, not all of them result in a fixed destiny. A lot of destiny is live, and it's in the moment. I like to play ping pong. And if I'm playing with somebody that has about the same skill level that I have in playing the game, the outcome isn't predestined. The outcome depends on who applies themselves more and who keeps their concentration, and that's what determines the outcome. It's the resolve and the application of how we participate in life. There are a lot of things that are like that in life, and they aren't all competitive. But we can get something out of the circumstances of life if we put ourselves more into them. Ultimately, all circumstances, the large and ponderous that are seemingly unchangeable, as well as the evanescent little things that come up from moment to moment, all of those things in the future are determined by what we do now, what we do in the moment. So if you want to have a better future, it all depends on what you're doing now. So even though we as human beings, as we are now, might be feeble and inattentive, compared to a magician or somebody like that. Some of the events in our life are determined, but it doesn't have to be that way. Ultimately, everything is on the table. Christ said, "Ask whatsoever ye will in my name, and it shall be given unto you." Sometimes the asking is a very steep asking, and it requires a lot of patience and a lot of effort. But there were no limitations, no modifiers. Ask whatsoever ye will. Not ask whatsoever you will, but not in the case that you have Saturn and Taurus or something like that. But whatever you will. So we're moving a little bit slowly, and I don't care because I haven't talked all summer, and I'm eager to talk.
Can we order pizza?
No, we're just about done. We have one more little short thing to look into. Act 1, Scene 2 is set on an island which is sometimes called Prospero's Island. And we're going to spend the rest of the evening talking about that. When we studied A Winter's Tale, we looked at the setting of the scene of the tempest there, and we saw the bear killing and eating Antigonus, and we saw the ship sinking. At that time, we noted that that whole scene is described by a loon going from the North Pole to the South Pole, that at its north end contains the bear, and at its south end has the broken and sinking ship called Argo Navis. We noted that there were other details of the scene, such as a casket and things like that are also in that same loon of the heavens. At that time, we looked a little bit into the meaning of that scene and related it to some of the other things in the Eleusinian mysteries that were indicated in that play. When we studied A Midsummer Night's Dream, we noted that quite a bit of the action took place in a secluded oak copse outside of Athens. At that time, we noted that the Eleusinian mysteries, which were sacred to Demeter, were celebrated in an oak copse outside of Athens. We noted that Demeter was often portrayed on urns and in fabrics with a horse's head. We briefly stated that initiates in the Egyptian mysteries and even the mysteries of India, going back to the Vedas 8,000 or 10,000 years ago, that in both of those mysteries, there was a part of the mysteries where the initiate took on him part, almost always the head, if not more, of an ass or of a horse. And that was supposed to be emblematic of the higher consciousness indicated by Sagittarius when those Vedic mysteries were begun in the precession of the equinox through Gemini, with the esoteric meaning coming from Sagittarius at the opposite end. So that the initiate, who in his initiation is opened up to the spiritual worlds and all the denizens therein, including the fairies, took on the horse's head or the ass's head. Now let's try to do something in a little bit different way, not quite so dramatic way, by looking at the setting for the tempest. An island is a small body of land surrounded by water. Land means and symbolically represents solid, tangible, objective experience. Water, by contrast, is much more elusive. It's subtle, and it's difficult to objectify. You can't grab a handful of water to look at it. Water, from times immemorial, has been seen as the womb of space, the womb that gives birth to stars and worlds from its apparent darkness and emptiness. To the physical eye, stars and galaxies are like so many little islands or archipelagos in the vast sea of space. Water has also represented chaos. Chaos as a space filled with the potential of becoming anything. It's rife with the stuff that becomes differentiated into cosmos. Seers claim that the space around us is really not empty, but it's filled with numerous realms and worlds whose state and organization is full, and it's subtle, and it's difficult for this kind of consciousness to understand. In a way, we are blessed that we have this world where things are abecedarian, where they're very elementary, very easy to understand. Chaos, or space, is rife with life and beings. It is chaotic. Seers claim that to the spiritual eye, it's a plenum. It's a very, very full to overflowing space. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't islands of limited consciousness. The stars and the galaxies are not just luminous gas balls of thermonuclear energy. They are light, but not merely sensible light, but they are sources of intelligible light. They are manifestations of self-conscious beings whose consciousness is almost inestimable to us. And those beings are creating and giving and growing and have their own internal evolutions within them. What we are looking at when we gaze on a starry night is a gigantic experiment and a magnificent creation, even though we see only just the smallest part of it. The potential of the womb of space, the potential of the unconsciousness that is represented by space or by the sea, is being brought to light by an alchemical experiment into that unknown. And it's being given out in a cosmic creation that is an all-consuming life sacrifice. Nothing else could produce that kind of a glow. So everything that we look at is always light, more light. And it's consciously trying to illumine the unconscious, the potential in the absolute. The unconscious to us is dark. The inner worlds to us are chaotic because we're imperfect, because we're limited, and because we live discordantly and chaotically. In In our inner life, we are trying to transmute the baser elements of our being into something higher by magic, and that process is often tempestuous. If we don't try to improve, life seems pleasant and easy. But as soon as we work in earnest and sincerely on self-betterment, a lot of those sleeping wolves of selfish consciousness spring to life, and there's a big struggle. Our self-consciousness, which has been with us since we've been little children, seems eternal. Seems like it's always there, and we're always ourselves. Our self-consciousness, which is applied to everything around us and can find meaning in it, seems universal. Our self-consciousness, because it is eternal and universal, seems divine. It is all of those things. But it is also thin, and it is currently limited. We aren't self-conscious of all of the myriad of miracles that our real self is doing even in our physical body. It's an example that I use frequently, but each and every second while we are sitting here, whether we're awake or asleep like Bob, each and every second, each one of us is generating 2 million red blood cells. Just in the course of time that it took me to say that sentence, there were probably 20 million red blood cells produced right in this room. It's a controlled process, and the consciousness of the self, though we're not self-conscious of it, is controlling it all. If we work with a good analytic psychologist, it wouldn't take very long to reveal that even quite a few of our thoughts and our desires we are not aware of. We're in the dark. Our self-consciousness is a tiny island. And since we're talking about the evolution of humanity as an individual or in collective, we're talking about that struggle, that tempest, and we're talking about that island of self-consciousness in the individual and collectively. One little bitty mystical experience would disabuse us of the notion that we are all-knowing in our self-consciousness. So we're all living on Prospero's Island, which is not only an island, but it is a star in the making. We're eventually going to give sensible and, more important, intelligible spiritual light out just as the stars do. We are filled with wonder and magic. An island can be a place of loneliness and isolation if we haven't turned our consciousness inward to discover our universality. If we haven't started the spontaneous combustion or the emanatory chain reaction. We're growing up on this island just as Miranda is growing up on this island. And until we can find the other within ourselves, we'll have that kind of loneliness. Our being, that is in our self-consciousness, is our experimental apparatus. It's our proving ground. It is where we find whether our creations are true or not. So we have a little bit of an idea of what goes on in the island of our consciousness and the sea of spiritual chaos that surrounds us. And we're now ready to start to really dig into the play in earnest, and we'll begin next time by seeing how we got here and where we're going, because Prospero sings sort of a long swan song about his history. And that's it. And thank you guys.